Hello, and welcome to another episode of Nostalgia vs. Reality, where I play and review the games that define my childhood, whether they've held up or not. Today, we're taking a look at Spyro 2 for the PlayStation. Whereas most people have their first 3D platforming experience with Super Mario 64, I wouldn't see the genre for several more years when I picked up a copy of Spyro 2 at my local EB. As such, since Spyro 2 was the first 3D platformer I ever played, I have somewhat of a unique view of the genre as a whole. The main reason I'm tackling Spyro 2 today is that I seem to be one of the few people who have fond memories of this series. Excluding its vague relation to Skylanders, Spyro seems to have been completely forgotten in the mainstream, and I want to know if there's a good reason for that. After an introductory cutscene, the game kicks off by dumping you right in the first level, revealing the basics of movement and combat. One would think that by 1999 developers would have gotten camera movement down, but no, Spyro 2's camera is terrible by default in its passive mode, and is only slightly improved by switching to an active mode where the camera actually follows you around like you'd expect it to. When it comes to its combat, Spyro 2 is a relatively simple game. Spyro has two combat moves. He can charge things, and he can breathe fire on them. This means that enemies are split into three categories. There are enemies you can only kill by charging them, there are enemies you can only kill with your fire breath, and there are enemies that can be killed either way. These three simple categories allow the designers to implement an amazing amount of enemy variety throughout Spyro 2's levels. Whereas many 3D platformers of the time simply use the same enemies in each world, Spyro 2 takes the unique aesthetic of each world and brings out both enemies and friendly NPCs to match that aesthetic. Each of these unique worlds is linked together through several hub worlds and are slowly unlocked through one of the three currencies that the game uses. The first and most plentiful type of currency, gems, are scattered throughout every world and hub world, but they're actually a persistent currency, which means there's limited amounts of them on each level, and once you collect them, they don't respawn. They're actually used to purchase things from money bags, who will sell you practically anything, from new moves to use of bridges, access to his private submarine, and most importantly, the ability to reach new levels that are hidden behind walls. The second type of currency, talismans, are gained when you go through one of the levels in the first two hub worlds in the most obvious way possible. You just rush to the end of the level and you'll get a talisman. These talismans are used to unlock the first two bosses, which are relatively easy. And after you defeat those bosses, you can move on to the next hub world, all the way through the third hub world, which is where our third currency comes into play. After being gradually introduced to orbs throughout the first two worlds, by the time you get to the third world, orbs become the primary method of unlocking things, from opening up new doors, to creating whirlwinds, to opening new levels, and eventually opening the door to the final boss. Orbs are perhaps the most important thing for you to collect in this game. But collecting them is the hardest out of all of the currencies. To collect orbs, you have to do side quests, more or less, things in levels that are off the beaten path. Each of these side quests has a difficulty rating, and obviously some of them are way easier to do than others. Of course, you only have to get 40 orbs to beat the game, but when I was a kid I 100%ed this game and got all of the orbs, which probably took me forever. These orb challenges can vary from playing hockey to trying to escort someone through a whole bunch of invincible rock men, to just finding one laying up on top of a ladder or somewhere where you had to backtrack to get it. Indeed, as you progress through the game and unlock new abilities, you will often find cause to go back to a level you've already beaten in order to climb a ladder or dive underwater to swim to a new area that has an orb or perhaps a new quest to get an orb. And in these orbs, which are scattered throughout every world with all sorts of different quests, we can see Spyro 2's primary strength, variety. There is so much variety in this, from all of the different worlds to all the different NPCs to these sort of weird stories that intertwine between the different levels. Everything about Spyro 2 screams production values, from the fully voiced ancillary characters to the insane level of variety and number of different models. They put a lot of time into this game. If the first Spyro was an attempt to clone the success of Super Mario 64, then Spyro 2 is the perfection of the 3D platforming formula. Spyro 2 remains my favorite 3D platformer of all time. In fact, when I went to review this game, I almost 100%ed it again. If you are at all a fan of 3D platformers, you owe it to yourself to try out Spyro 2. It's relatively easy to find and it won't cost you more than $10. That'll do it for this installment of Nostalgia vs. Reality. Join me next time when we take a look at Starfleet Command 3.
It has been some time since the USS Voyager returned home.